Aloha and welcome to today's session, AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships Info Session. My name is Kristen Connors and I'm the Fellowship, Scholarships, and Professional Development Coordinator in Graduate Division, and I'll be your moderator for today. Today you'll hear from the Project Director at AAAS STPF, Jessica Sewell, along with some of the fellows in the program. And you'll also be able to hear about other opportunities available through AAAS's partner societies. At the end of the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to ask our panel questions. And at this time, I would like to turn things over to Jessica Sewell, the Project Director for AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. Jessica?
Hi, Kristen, and hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Sewell, the Project Director for Recruitment and Alumni Engagement for the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. Thank you, Kristen, the Graduate Division, for hosting us. We're really happy to be here today. And thank you to our panelists, Cherie Watson and Aubrey Paris. We're grateful that you can join us today. Cherie and Aubrey, are you willing to introduce yourselves briefly by sharing your name, fellowship placement, and any connection that you might have to the university? Cherie?
Sure. So I'm currently in my second year of my AAAS fellowship, and I am with currently placed with the U.S. Geological Survey, and this is my second year there. And I'm connected to the University of Hawaii because I was actually doing a postdoc at the University of Hawaii Manoa with the Pacific Bioscience Research Center prior to applying for the AAAS fellowship.
Thank you, Cherie. Thanks for being here. And Aubrey?
Sure, Jessica. Hi, everyone. My name is Aubrey Paris, and I am the current IEEE USA sponsored fellow at the U.S. Department of State, where I work in the Office of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. I know we'll be talking a bit more about the work that we do later, but I don't have any personal connections to the University of Hawaii besides wishing I could come visit. So looking forward to all of your questions.
Thank you both. And next slide. We'll be hearing from Aubrey and Cherie a lot more later, so thank you both for those quick introductions now. And before we go much further, I'm really curious if you can raise your hands virtually, if you have heard of AAAS before, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Okay, oh, I see hands. Okay, great. Okay, and next. And I wonder, how many of you have ever heard of the journal Science? Same thing, raising hands. Great, I see some more hands. So AAAS is the publisher of the journal Science. And so many people and many scientists know us through science, but AAAS does so much more. Our mission is to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. And our organization focuses on advocacy for evidence, science diplomacy, careers in STEM, and so it's very easy to see why science policy has its home with AAAS. Next slide. And so I'm guessing that everybody who's here today might have some interest in policy, interest in science policy, connecting the work and the research you're doing to inform decision making. And that's exactly why we operate a science policy fellowship, because scientific and technological information is critical to developing good policies. And it's mutually beneficial. Host agencies who host our fellows gain access to talented scientists and engineers like Aubrey and Cherie and yourselves, who come from across a range of different career stages, disciplines, and backgrounds. And then fellows gain firsthand experience in how the federal policy system operates, sometimes doesn't, and an understanding of how science can support decision-making and implementation. Next slide. So the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships program has placements in what we call 4 program areas. 3 of them mirror the federal government: executive, legislative, and judicial, like the branches. And we also have an endowed fellowship called the Roger Revelle Fellowship that is actually accepting applications this year. So really quickly, the executive branch fellowship opportunities are the most numerous of the 4 fellowship program areas that you're seeing on the screen. And those fellows are, like Cherie, they're in places like the US Geological Survey, NOAA, the EPA, the Department of Energy, the State Department, and many other agencies, and they contribute to federal policy, administration, and implementation. Now, congressional fellows spend a year on Capitol Hill helping research, develop, and draft legislation and provide input to policy review and oversight, working in the offices of senators, representatives, or on committees. And one thing to note, and we will go into in much greater detail later, is that AAAS works with partner societies who help to sponsor both congressional and executive branch fellows. And so in addition to applying to a fellowship through AAAS, you also may be able to apply to one or more of these partner societies that we work with, like the American Chemical Society, American Sociological Association, or IEEE USA, like Aubrey mentioned. And then we have a placement in the judicial branch that is working with judges in the Federal Judicial Center, helping contribute scientific expertise to the federal court staff and judges through education programs, legal reports, and learning about what are the contemporary policy issues facing the court system, like bias and AI. And then, as I mentioned before, we have this endowed fellowship, the Roger Revelle Fellowship, offered once every 4 years, that is focused on global stewardship issues. But one thing to highlight for this is that the Roger Revelle Fellow, one of the eligibility requirements is at least 7 years of post-degree professional experience. Next slide. I know I was just throwing a lot of information in terms at us. And so this is a more of a visual representation of some of the logos of agencies and offices that host our fellows. And I share this slide because I would love to see hands raised if you recognize the logo of an agency. Perhaps they've funded research, host initiatives or programs that you care about. Do I see any hands? Like there's the NSF, the USDA, the FDA. Maybe it's not even related to your research, just things that are important to our country. Okay, I see a lot, I see some hands raised. So these are just some of the many agencies and offices that host our fellows. But we do hear all of the time that as people apply to the program, they discover agencies and offices doing work that they never knew existed and never knew that it was under the umbrella of the mission of an agency in the federal government. And so that is completely normal. And even I, as a staff person who works with the fellowship, I'm surprised all of the time hearing what fellows are doing. Okay, next slide. And as I mentioned before, in addition to applying through the AAAS for one of these policy fellowships, we work with nearly 30 partner societies who also fund fellowship placements. And these are logos of many of those societies, including IEEE USA, which Aubrey will talk more about later. But you can apply to STPF through the AAAS and to as many of these partner societies as you are eligible and able and have the energy to do. There's not a conflict. So you can apply through them and through us. That is completely welcome and encouraged. And each of these societies has slightly different eligibility requirements, application process, selection criteria, and while challenging at times, that is a good thing because not all of them have the same requirements. Like for instance, our fellowship at AAAS requires you have completed your degree at the time that you apply, while many of these partners let you apply while you're completing your degree, as long as you have it completed by the time your fellowship starts. And there are also differences in citizenship and other requirements. So just wanted to really call attention to that because we can focus on some of these other options during the conversation today. Next slide. And people often ask me, how many placements are there? You know, how competitive is this? And I wanted to share this because this was the class of 2019-20, and it represents 273 fellows and very different experiences. But yeah, with more than 150 new placements every year, there is a strong need for scientists and engineers in this fellowship in the federal government. And we're looking for scientists and engineers of all stripes. And so if this is something that's of interest to you, I really hope that you can come out of this with some resources and tips and some energy to consider applying. Next slide. And in addition to this being a full-time position working in a placement in the federal government, the fellowship supports fellows through formal professional development. And I just want to call attention to this because we recognize that the fellowship is a year of service and learning. We have a lot of fellows who come who have an interest in policy, but not a lot of policy experience. And we understand that this fellowship is meant to be the deep dive where you're learning about the federal government, building and enhancing your communication skills, your leadership skills, and your network. And this all kicks off with a 2-week-long orientation every September where we welcome the cohort of new fellows and you get to network with your fellow fellows. And we did that all virtually this year. And it was really exciting to see the same kind of camaraderie and energy in a different kind of setting and to see all of the great ideas that are coming to Washington, D.C. Virtually this year. Next slide. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, you might be wondering, what can I do to begin right now to be a strong candidate for this fellowship or one of these partner society fellowships? The answer is being here in this webinar is a great start, and continuing to work on your degree and excel in your field of study. Your scientific and technical background is really important to our reviewers, who I can talk more about later, but that counts for 40 of 100 points when materials are being reviewed. And then other ways to stand out for reviewers are to focus on your leadership skills, problem-solving abilities, communication and outreach skills, and a commitment to the fellowship mission, so public service, flexibility, and interest in giving back, and also learning for your own career growth. And we will talk about this in much greater detail and hear from Cherie and Aubrey about their personal experiences applying and being fellows. So with that, I'm going to pause and transition back to hear more from Cherie and Aubrey about their background and experience as fellows. So what were their technical backgrounds and how did they hear about the fellowship? Did they sit in a webinar like this and hear about the fellowship years ago? And what is life like for them as fellows now? So with that, and thank you all for listening to me, I will ask Cherie to share more about her experiences.
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. I will just talk briefly about my path to a AAAS fellowship. So I finished my PhD in 2017 from Oregon Health and Science University. And during that time, I worked a lot in the field as an environmental scientist with federal scientists from USGS and NOAA and a couple other agencies, maybe some local state agencies. But at the time, I was really interested in the work that they did. And one of the avenues that I knew I could probably try upon completing, well, there's a couple different things you can do, right? You can put in for opportunities and internships and fellowships while you're a student, or you can wait and do it after you're finished. And so I looked at both the Knaus Fellowship through NOAA and then AAAS. And timing wise, AAAS fit better for me. I got a postdoc to go to the University of Hawaii, like I mentioned before, after I completed my PhD. I had spent time previous to my PhD as a high school teacher and in STEM outreach, and those were still interests of mine. And so coming out to University of Hawaii, I worked in a postdoc that allowed me to get out and work with people, continue to do that work. But again, at University of Hawaii, I worked with more scientists from USGS. And that kind of confirmed that my next opportunity, I wanted to do something that would get me involved in a federal science agency. And so I had talked to a handful of people from AAAS, mostly at the Society SACNAS conference, Society for Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. They always had a booth there, and they were always willing to answer my silly, stupid questions, which I asked every year. But I also got to talk to some fellows who had gone through it there and who gave me kind of some background on how to do it and how to proceed. So I applied and was accepted and got in and went through the interview process. And then I had quite a few agencies that I got to meet with, more than I thought I would. And interview with, and then it's kind of like a, what do you call it, match.com, where like your mutual interests come together in an agency and you find each other, and if it's a good match, then you end up there. And I ended up at the U.S. Geological Survey. I work out of the director's office in the Office of Science, Quality, and Integrity. It's a support office for science at USGS, and it's really a great office. There's scientists from all over the agency that work there, and so I get to work on and see a variety of different things. This past year, I was able to sit in on an evaluation committee on how scientists are evaluated at USGS. And so that allows them to move up in step regarding their scientific value and what they've done. And that was a really great experience. I'm working at USGS in citizen science, crowdsourcing in citizen science. And that's really, those activities really come out of a federal act that came about and said these kind of activities will help engage more citizens in science. And so it's been great to review that on a federal level. I've been able to participate in some interagency working groups. So people from all over the federal government getting together and talking about practices in STEM activities, as well as crowdsourcing and citizen science. It's given me a really good feel for federal government as a whole. So I've really enjoyed it. My second year, I'm actually, this was a model that USGS put forward last year, but they said, wouldn't it be great, because USGS has offices all over the country. They proposed having a fellow like myself do a year at the headquarters in Northern Virginia, and then do a year out at one of their science centers or in the field. And so actually this year I've negotiated, because headquarters is closed, to spend my second year out in a science center. And so I'm out in Montana at the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, but I also get to work with a water science center out here. I'm still working with Climate Adaptation Science Center in Hawaii. And so sitting in Montana, I'm working with 2 USGS agencies in Hawaii and 2 in Montana, as well as working with headquarters. And that is I'm getting to see more of USGS than a lot of people who have been working in USGS for years. So the opportunity and the ability to be flexible with what I'm doing, right, has just been incredible. I pretty much created the projects that I'm working on this year based on what I did last year, and they've given me the freedom to do that, and it's really, I don't know that I'll get another opportunity like this. It's been incredible. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end about my experience.
Thank you, Sheree. And it's so wonderful to hear that there is a common thread of what you're passionate about and how it connects to your work and what you're doing today. Aubrey, are you willing to share a little bit about your story?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica. I'm excited to hear from Sheree too, because it sounds like we both have really benefited from having a certain amount of freedom and ability to be creative in our fellowships, which I'm happy to expand on later. But I think my story really starts when I was in college as an undergraduate. I went to a small liberal arts school in Pennsylvania called Ursinus College. I like to shout it out whenever I can. And while I was in college, I double majored in chemistry and biology and got involved in a program at my college called the Center for Science and the Common Good, which was really focused on examining the intersections between science and society from any perspective you can think of, whether it's public health or communication or law or ethics or philosophy or policy. And so that was my first real taste of what it could mean to be a scientist outside of the lab. Now, that was something that was really appealing to me, but I knew I wanted to become sort of a scientific expert in some field or some area first. So I went on to pursue my PhD in chemistry and materials science at Princeton University, where from the get-go, I was very upfront with my PI that I would not be pursuing a career in academia or even industry. I wanted to sort of go the policy route. And it was really important to me to find a PI that was supportive, actively supportive of that trajectory. And so even for folks who might already have a PI and they may be more or less supportive, I think it's always a really good idea to find a mentor where you are currently situated who can provide you with the guidance and advice, because that was something that was really useful to me. During my PhD, I made an effort to stay involved in other outside of the lab type activities that I was passionate about and that I thought would give me skills that would be useful later on outside of the lab. So I had a part-time job with a science policy think tank that really started to give me experience in a variety of subject areas that have this science policy intersection. Topics like food security, public health, climate, synthetic biology, AI, all across the board. And I also gave myself some experience in science communication by starting and producing and co-hosting a podcast dedicated to translating hot topics in science and technology for non-scientific audiences. Now, I specifically mention these two experiences because these are two experiences that I think helped set me apart when it came to my application for policy fellowship programs. When I was nearing the end of my PhD, I ended up finishing spring of 2019. Back in the fall prior, I started looking for opportunities to get into the policy arena. And I learned that here in the United States, one of the most effective ways for scientists to transition into the policy sphere, especially at the federal level, is through these things called science and technology policy fellowships. So I started doing the research and learning about the requirements and the process for application for AAAS and a variety of partner societies that it turned out I was eligible to be a member of and to apply through. And based on my timeline, the partner societies made more sense for me. So one of the key factors in my decision of which fellowships to apply for was the fact that I wanted to go straight from my PhD into one of these fellowships without having to take a gap year. You know, a few months off was fine, but I didn't want to have to go a full year or take on a postdoc or something like that. So for the fellowships that I applied for through the partner societies, I applied to maybe 6 or 7. All of them had in common the fact that all you needed, as Jessica alluded to earlier, was to have your degree in hand, your PhD in hand by the time your fellowship was set to start. And so that was the boat that I was in. The fellowships typically start in the fall. So AAAS around September 1. And if you're in the State Department like me, that can be slowed up a little bit because you need to get a security clearance. But the fall is the benchmark. And so I applied. I was awarded the IEEE USA Executive Branch Fellowship, which automatically earmarks you for the U.S. Department of State, which, if you're not familiar, is the U.S. federal agency responsible for developing and implementing foreign policy and conducting international diplomacy. So, as I mentioned previously, I'm placed in the Office of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, and my office title is a Science and Technology Policy Advisor. My day-to-day work, I would summarize as having sort of two arms. On the one hand, I do some policy work related to international biotechnology policy. And on the other hand, which is actually where most of my time is spent these days, is sort of in the public diplomacy arena. So public diplomacy and public affairs is all of our external engagement and outreach with audiences internationally and domestically. So I was given the task of leading our office's global science, technology, and innovation public diplomacy campaign, which is seeking to empower the use of science, technology, and innovation to solve global challenges. So it involves speaking with all sorts of wide audiences, in person, virtually, via various platforms. And that's been a lot of fun because that was a project that I got to develop from the ground up. So kind of harkening back to that freedom to explore and be given that responsibility that Shuri also mentioned. In terms of one of the perks that I would analogize to Shuri's experience as well would be the fact that in my day-to-day work, I'm constantly communicating and working with our US missions overseas, the embassies and the consulates in various countries around the world, whether it's to connect them with entrepreneurs, whether it's to help them address challenges they're working on in their day-to-day work, or planning a trip to go out there to do some of my work. That's a really unique thing associated with the State Department. And of course, the State Department, USGS are not the only two places you could end up. And so throughout the rest of this conversation, I would love to be able to answer your questions about the Partner Society pathway, the State Department, anything, fair game. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Jessica.
Thank you both for sharing. And I just love hearing from fellows about what their understanding was of the fellowship, or these fellowships as an opportunity when they were in graduate school, when they were completing their degree, and then how it really evolves and goes into this experience where you can't even know what it will be like as a fellow and what opportunities or doors might open during the fellowship to be like Shuri, where suddenly you're in a new place and you have this entirely different view and experience that we could never have predicted 12 months ago. So thank you both for sharing, and I will try to spend the next few minutes grounding us back in what is that first step we can take? What can we look at when we think about this is something that I actually would like to apply to? What can I expect if I'm applying? And then after I hit submit on that application, what can I expect from an interview process? As Shuri mentioned, the Match.com experience of learning about where you may be placed as a fellow. And I'm going to share this from the perspective of the AAAS S&T policy fellowships, but I think that a lot of the advice in general will apply broadly to partner societies and what they might expect from potential applicants, and is probably just good advice for any employer. So next slide. I will try to get through this all efficiently so that we can hear more about real talk from Shuri and Aubrey about what was it actually like applying and interviewing. But our STPF application, this is our application portal. There's the web address down below in case you're really eager and wanted to go and visit now or start. It's fellowshipapp.AAAS.org. And there are 8 steps to our application. I promise they are not all equally long. So the first step is a self-check, something you can take as many times as you need. So if you're getting a message that says you're not eligible, you can always check to make sure you're not checking that you're an employee of AAAS if you're not. And you can take it as many times as you need, and if you pass, you save it. And then that will take you to step 2. And that is applicant background. And so that is you, your educational history, the degree you're pursuing now, your address, things we fill out on many forms. This is also the place where you'll upload a CV. And for our application, there is a 5-page limit on a CV. And so sometimes this can be a challenge because you will decide as the applicant how you're presenting your experience and what format it will take and how long to make it, but there is a 5-page limit. Next step is step 3, which is verification, which is working with a third-party group that we work with who verifies your citizenship, which is one of our eligibility requirements, and also verifies your degree, that you have earned that qualifying degree by our application deadline, or that you've successfully defended and completed revisions and completed your coursework by the deadline, and you're just waiting for the institution to confer the degree. So that all happens in step 3. Now, step 4 is the exciting step where you get to pick which of the 2 program areas that we're talking about earlier that you would like to apply to. So executive and legislative, or executive and judicial, or judicial and legislative. So you get to pick up to 2 of them to be considered for at once. I do encourage everybody who's considering to have one of their options be executive, just because there's so many opportunities, more than 100 placements in a lot of different agencies. And when you apply to executive, you're really saying, consider me for all of the opportunities in this placement or in this program area. And then for the next step, step 5, and for all the ones below, 5, 6, and 7, you're actually going to start to customize what you're responding, your responses, your essays, even your references can be tailored to those 2 program areas. And so there's kind of the universal application of 1 through 4, and then for 5, 6, and 7, you can start to tailor those. And so step 5 is you're picking up to 3 references who will write letters of reference for you and submit them. They also need to be in by the application deadline of November 1st. And you can use the same references for 2 program areas when you're applying, or you can ask different people to provide letters of reference. If somebody can speak to your experience in a way that you think would work really well for one program area, like the judicial branch with law and federal judges, that might not work as well in another setting. For step 6, that is going to be where you're writing more of the essays, candidate statements, where you're talking about why you're interested in science policy, how it lines up well with your career interests and career path, what you're hoping you can contribute as a fellow, what policy interests you have, and then also what you're hoping to take away from the fellowship. And then step 7 is you get to review everything. Really encourage you and to have somebody else besides you reviewing this all, helping to review for typos and the grammatical errors, and also just to make sure that you're being concise and really representing yourself and being authentic with your own true voice. And then step 8 is hitting submit. All right, next slide. And so you get to that point, you hit submit before November 1st, you go like, whew, you celebrate, and then what happens next? So you will get a message from our team probably within a month in late November or into December that's letting you know, thank you for applying. Well, you'll get a thank you for applying right away, but you'll get another note that says, we've reviewed this and we agree that you are eligible, which is kind of reconfirming that step 1 eligibility self-check. And then sometime in the winter, either late January or into February, that is when your materials will have been reviewed. And at that point, if your materials are compelling, you'll be invited for a virtual semi-finalist interview. And at that point, you'll be asked to write a 1-page policy memo. You'll be given options to choose from, and you'll have, I think it's a week, it might be 10 days to write that policy memo, and you'll submit it in advance of your virtual interview, and then you'll meet with the reviewers virtually, and you'll talk about that memo and present on it, and then answer other questions. And collectively, those written materials and then that virtual interview, that's what the committee of reviewers have to make a decision on whether or not they think you would either be a good fellow in the case of the judicial or the legislative branch fellowship placements, or a good finalist for executive branch fellows, like Shuri was mentioning earlier. And at that point, if we think you would make an excellent executive branch finalist, you are invited to interview week, where you get to set up interviews and be interviewed by and interview 5, 10, 15 different offices and agencies who are wanting to learn more about you, and you're also interviewing them to see if it's a good fit. And at the end of that interview week, you may have offers that you get to review, and then you as the candidate get to make a final decision about what offer you accept. And then all of this is hopefully resolved by May into early June. You know if you have a fellowship that will begin September 1st of that fall. And the last thing I do want to share is a little bit about peeling back the mystery of who is reviewing all of these. Well, our review committees are very heavily alumni fellows, people who have done the fellowship, who have been in your shoes and are very familiar and passionate about science policy. And we also try to have the committees be very represented across race, ethnicity, gender, and disciplines, so that there's somebody who is in that committee reviewing applications who can speak to your discipline or your career stage or your background, to help the other committee members fully understand you, because we have fellows who are engineers and veterinarians and economists and sociologists and everything in between. And so we try our best to have these be really well represented for our applicants. And with that, I'm going to pause myself, and I would love to hear from you, Shuri, if any of this sounds correct, and if there was anything in particular that you would like to speak more about that either surprised you or was very important as you applied and went through the interview process?
You hit on, I think, the one that I didn't realize was really important until afterwards, but I think it's important to do your homework about where you might want to be placed. So Jessica mentioned all the different agencies that will show up and will want fellows. I think it's up to you to do the work to figure out where that's a good fit. There were several agencies that I got interviews at that I had never heard of before, and I knew a couple that I did want to work at, but I should have looked at a wider range, and just the breadth of programs and agencies that are available to you. It will not do you any harm to go a little extra and look into some of the federal agencies that you would have never thought of before. And then you place that language in your application. You know, I want USGS because of these reasons. Because if you get to that interview point and you get to the matching stage, they have your application in hand and they're going to choose to meet with you based on what you said in your interest letter. And so be as specific as possible and do your homework to figure out where it's a good fit for you, right? Because they're gonna want to see everybody, and they think they have an idea of who you are and what they want. So really, I like how Jessica put that interview process where you're meeting people is more about you finding the right fit, because they will literally, at that point when you're interviewing, they would take any of you, and so it's up to you to figure out where I fit best, and you can do that by kind of spending some time on the application process ahead of time.
I just want to reiterate, Sheree, that you're making such a good point, which is you are speaking to two different audiences when you're writing this application for SDPF. So you are speaking to those reviewers, those alumni fellows, the people reading the materials who are really looking to see, is this somebody who would make a good fellow in general, who would make a good fellow for our federal partners? And that's one set of eyes. So they're looking for that demonstrated interest in policy, that you can maybe speak to some of these agencies or places where your expertise and background could make a difference. And then if you become a finalist, your materials get into the hands of these offices who are really interviewing for you for specific positions. And so then that's a different perspective to keep in mind. And you're trying to thread the needle of talking to both of these at once with character limitations. So we appreciate the challenge that's ahead of you. Aubrey, how does all of this compare to what you did when you were applying to your several partner societies?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think, first and foremost, it's important to recognize that all of the applications, as you mentioned before, are a little bit different, whether it's timeline or the steps or what an interview looks like, etc. So that is, we could be here for hours just talking about each one individually. We're obviously not going to do that. So I'll give an example specifically related to IEEE, so I guess everyone can see just what one example could look like. From the get-go, I think the application deadlines for the partner societies, for the most part, from what I saw, were a little bit later than AAAS. So I believe my earliest one was in December. And then I think most of the others I applied for ended in January 1. But when I applied, the IEEE fellowship was due around December 15th. I had a nice spreadsheet where I kept track of all the deadlines and did them in the order that they were going to be due. By the time I submitted that application and heard back, I got a confirmation that my application was received, but I didn't hear anything back regarding an interview until midwinter. So I ended up doing 2 interviews, one for IEEE, one for AIP, American Institute of Physics. And those were both, I would say, late January, early February timeline. I think one of the key differences here in terms of when you become a fellow is that there's almost one less step in the partner societies in that by the time I did my interviews, which at the time were in person, who knows what's going to happen these days, but by the time I did those interviews, I found out within 24 hours that I was the IEEE fellow. I was selected immediately because they, did all of their interviews and they're picking one person instead of filling 100 plus spots. So so that was the main difference. By the time all of the the AAAS finalists were going to their interview week to meet with all of the potential agencies and offices, I was also there because I was given the opportunity to take meetings with different State Department offices, but I had a little bit different perspective because at that point, I was at least maybe a little bit more settled. I wasn't still competing to be a final, like to be no longer a finalist and to be a fellow. I had my fellowship. I just had to find the placement. So that's, I think, probably the key difference. Something we also, I don't think, have talked about here that I think is worth noting, and we can talk about this more later if people are interested, but something else that I think AAAS and at least IEEE and AIP have in common is a writing requirement um, during the application process that's not formally part of the application packet. So for IEEE, and Jessica or Cherie can talk about this from the AAAS perspective, but when I was notified that I was going to have an interview, I was basically sent a writing prompt. And that writing prompt was, you have 72 hours to produce a briefing memo on a topic of your choice related to science and technology and policy. And that was it. That was the prompt. Turned it in 72 hours. And that became part of my application packet that my interviewers were using when they interviewed me. And so, they're asking questions about my CV and my extracurricular experiences and why I wanted to work at the State Department, and my briefing memo and the recommendations I put forth in that memo, et cetera. So, so yeah, I think, the general steps are the same. It's just the timelines get to be a little bit different, and the actual application materials, I think, look a little different as well.
So I think we could chat all day. Kristen, I'm wondering, are there any questions from the audience that you would like for us to turn to?
Yes, we do have a question. So our first question is that someone is interested in pursuing the path to the Department of State. Are there other fellowships outside of IEEE that you also would recommend or that should be considered if you're facing the same gap year issue that Aubrey ran into?
Yeah, I'll start with that. So if the particular concern is you want to be able to enter in right after your PhD and you're finishing on, I say a lot of people tend to finish in the spring, right, is when many people end up finishing their degrees. If you're in a similar boat as me, I would say that to get to the Department of State, there are two primary fellowships to look into that are specifically science and technology related. Those would be IEEE USA, which of course I did, and the AIP fellowship that I've also referenced. So those two organizations have both a State Department track, and they have a separate application if you want to go the congressional route, so legislative branch. But those are the two that do have someone that sort of is sent straight to the State Department. If you are open to having, that gap year type of deal, AAAS, of course, sends many folks to the State Department. I believe we have around 30 right now. Jessica, I don't know if you know the exact number, but we have a lot of AAAS fellows in the State Department. For folks who are interested but might be, I don't know if this applies to anyone in this crowd, for more mid to late career scientists, there is a program that's completely separate from everything we're talking about here today called the Jefferson Science Fellows Program. And then if none of this sounds like it would work for you for various reasons, there are other ways to get into the State Department at a straight out of graduate school way if you're not necessarily committed or adamant about having this STPF behind your name. So for example, the State Department has a Pathways program, which usually coincides with a master's degree program at GW, George Washington University. There's the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. There are other ways. There's USA Jobs, the traditional get a job in government website. But in terms of the fellowship programs, I think if you're trying to avoid the gap year, IEEE and AIP are your first bet. And I should also caveat that by saying you might not think you qualify for one of these organizations, but you'd be surprised at how broadly these organizations, these partner societies, define their membership. I was shocked that I was able to apply to 6 or 7 different ones. So,
thank you. Jessica, speaking about the Partner Society fellowship opportunities, are those listed on the AAAS website, or do you have to go directly to the Partner Society websites themselves?
So there is a page that's dedicated to the partner societies, and on that page there are links over to their individual pages. And so it's a mix of both, where you can find the list of them all, but you will need to click on them and go over to those sites because they can change from year to year, and they're updating them. As Aubrey said, some of them don't have deadlines until December, January, February of next year, and so some of them will need to be updated soon with the application timeline. But we can make sure that I share that with you, Kristen, so then you can share that with anybody who's interested.
Okay, thank you. And are there a certain number of fellowships for specific fields?
That's a great question. So we do not have any kind of quota system or expectation for the fields that our fellows are going to come from. And so we do find that it varies from year to year, and that is completely welcome because AAAS, we're almost like a matchmaker where the federal agencies, their placements and their needs change from year to year too, depending on the priorities of their agencies and offices, like what their missions are. And so there's that flexibility on both sides where at this time of this year, for the federal agencies, they are also submitting their fellowship placement descriptions to us at the same time as future fellows are applying. And so we never quite know what the strongest demand is going to be, and we don't know right now who our future fellows will be. But you don't need to worry. If there are 30 of you and you're all in the same department and you're all really strong candidates, that's a really good thing. And the reviewers don't know who else is applying. They don't know higher level information about any of that. And so you're really not competing. To the best of your ability, try not to think about competing with other people and really focus on putting your best foot forward and really representing yourself and why you're passionate about what you're passionate about and why this fellowship is the right place to explore and pursue that, because that is the voice that I think is really going to be compelling to the reviewers. And Shri, I see you nodding along in case there's anything you want to add.
No, I agree with everything you said.
Going back to the fellowship criteria, what types of key experiences should you be building on your CV to be a competitive applicant? And maybe I can get back to that slide to take a look at that.
Jessica, did you want to take a first, overarching look, and then we can give tips, or?
Sure, and I think I will give the annoying answer, which is I think you can be working on all of them. I think that there are things you're probably already doing that touch upon some of these, and it's often about how you're reflecting on what you are already doing and taking away the lessons learned from that activity more than what the activity is. So for example, I was talking with somebody and I was talking about babysitting, right? If I babysat, I could say, oh, I was only babysitting. That has nothing to do with, this. Or I could say I was entrepreneurial. I had responsibility. I was independent, right? What are the characteristics or skills I was building through that experience that I can then say, I now have these skills and I can bring them to fill your position and be a strong fellow. And in fact, not everybody has my experience and background, and that makes me even more unique. And then I would say the other thing is, what are the things you're passionate about? What are the things that you can really kind of sustain energy and momentum with, in addition to the degree you're working on? Because I know that's already a lot. And so if there are things that you're really passionate about, like communicating to young people or working, in your place of worship, if there's something that really speaks to you and that's what you can focus on, like, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think there's something really important that Jessica touched on, which is skills. Skills are transferable, even if you're not going to be doing the same thing that you did in your lab or in the field previously in this new position that you're going to hopefully get. And so I think on the one hand, if you can take advantage of extracurricular opportunities that are in line with your passions, your interests, then that's amazing. And it automatically, I think, sets you a little bit apart. And if you aren't able to take advantage of some of those extracurricular activities, find ways to tell stories about your lab experiences that show transferable skills. Oh, I mentored 5 undergraduates. Okay, now you have experience in leadership and mentorship and everything. You were in charge of a particular instrument in the lab. Again, now you're showing that you can learn on the fly and manage something and fix things when they're broken, and all of that is really important. So that, I think, would be the one aspect that I would say. The other aspect, I like to think about different experiences in terms of categories, and um, I think a variety of experiences can fall into maybe 5 buckets. So we have research, which everyone's already doing, and you can get a lot of skills out of research. I think there's policy, politics, civic engagement. I think there's communication. I would say there's entrepreneurship, and then maybe interdisciplinarity, which kind of catches everything else in a lot of senses. And so you don't have to do things in all of those buckets, but if you can show that you're doing some of these things and how that relates to your passions and relates to what you could be doing working in a federal agency, that's phenomenal. So those would be my answers to that question. I'm sure Shuri has something to add.
I would just add that I remember I was really nervous about the interview for AAAS. It was virtual, and it was, they kept warning us we're going to be on a big screen and there'd be all these people in the room, right? And so everything behind you is going to be accentuated. Anyway, I remember getting really nervous, right? As you get to your PhD and you're in a postdoc, you're pretty focused, and right, and you're very focused on your research and what you're doing. And not one of my questions was about my science. All of my questions were about reflecting on what I do as a scientist, and all of my answers didn't come from my science background. They came from my life experience. And so I would just keep that in mind. It kind of reiterates what Aubrey said, that this is a different experience than what you've been going through for the last 5-7 years. This is going to stretch you in ways that your science background prepped you for, but that is going to expand your horizons and your opportunities. So be open to that too. Be open to being challenged in those directions too. I think that's the best part about this opportunity too.
Thank you, Cherie, for those closing remarks. It looks like we don't have any other questions from the audience. Just in general from the panel, do you have just one last tip that you would want to close with and leave our students with?
I think mine is just that you really belong here and are really needed. And so if this is something that you are interested in and want to learn more about, please stay in touch with me, Aubrey, Cherie, Kristen, and any other fellows that you find along your way. I know there are some on campus and all over social media and LinkedIn. We just are really happy to be part of your network and part of your science policy journey.
I would just add, I was telling Kristen earlier on that I met someone at this session last year, and she really wanted to apply. And so we stayed in touch, and I helped her through the, when she wanted advice, she'd reach out to me, and I stayed in touch with her through the entire year up through her placement, and we're still talking, right? And I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'd be happy if you have questions as you're moving through, or just want even someone to take a look at your materials. I would be happy to do that with anyone who's interested in the fellowship in AAAS.
Thank you so much, Sheree.
I'll definitely do the same. I think my closing remark would be open to all of the different opportunities that are available to you through the application and interview process. But if there is something very specific that you want to get out of your fellowship, you should also be very clear about that as well, because that's going to make sure that you find the best placement for you, both to accomplish your personal goals and to make sure that the office taking you knows what they're getting. So be open, but as you figure out what you want to do, make that clear.
Excellent. Thank you so, so much. Just want to give a big mahalo to all our panelists today. Thank you also to our attendees for joining us. So thank you. Mahalo. This concludes our session for today.
Thank you all. Bye.